Hello and welcome. Another episode of Cavell Cloud Conversations. Your hosts, Finbarr and Patrick. As always, Patrick, how are we doing on this lovely Friday?
Very well, thank you, Finbar. Really exciting start to the year. Loads and loads of projects on. Lots happening in the communication space that we talked about. Some of which already resonate to our predictions podcast as well. So it's looking pretty good. But lots and lots going on.
A lot of accurate predictions in those podcasts, so go back and listen to it if you haven't yet already. So, what are we talking about today? We are talking about the growth in consumer focused legislation in Europe. Obviously, being European based analysts, we are very keen to see what's happening in the regulation space in Europe. Now, last year we had the European AI Act, which laid down broad principles that people should follow when dealing and implementing automation, but there wasn't a lot of clear regulation or specificity about exactly what that meant. There was just this broad idea that if someone was talking to a machine, you should, identify that machine and then you should do that. But we are starting to see the first regulations inspired by that rolling out into different countries. And if you're not from Europe, you might not be familiar with how that goes. The European Parliament will pass a broad act, and then it's up for individual countries to interpret and pass that laws that implement parts of that act and decide how strict or not strict they're going to go with that piece of legislation. How strict are they going? That's the question, right? So last year in the US, there was a proposal for a regulation that did not pass, bipartisan proposal, that basically said, when someone calls up, there is a mandated escalation route, human answer time. In practical terms, Patrick, I'm sure you can imagine what that means. You call up the store to return the top
Yeah.
you're wearing or something like that. You do get connected to a robot and you say, okay, you're not helping me. There is a button that you can press that connects you to a human being. How are you
Rather than
feeling
me just
about that?
going human, 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 or agent, 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 as we do now, or tap nine,
Well,
tap
exactly.
nine.
Kind of the point of that law was this is what people already want, so let's make sure that companies have to apply it uniformly. I mean, does that feel like a burden that the sector should have to you? That's the question, I guess.
Um, Ultimately, I don't know if it's something that should be legislated for.
Okay.
I think it should be in an open market environment. Surely it should be at the discretion of the consumer to decide if the service that your service provider is not your customer service provider is not providing. You vote with your feet or with your hands and your head and go elsewhere. I'm the only reason I'm thinking that is because if it's legislated that you have to notify someone that it's in artificial intelligence they're talking to, assuming that is potentially going to be providing some sort of service they don't like. We've known for years, Finbar, there is a massive variance in brands that provide customer service as to how much they pay to provide a certain level of experience. And a lot of those, one of the big complaints in the past has been big providers that just outsource it to, other markets, offshore it. It's significantly cheaper. The service provided might not be as good. And that's been a real USP of a lot of businesses, both in the States and in European markets, that we have contact centers those businesses say we've got contact centers in your home market, and that in theory gives the consumer impression that the service is going to be better. So I'm not sure if it should be something that should be legislated for. I think maybe the consumers can decide to vote with their feet.
Well, that is interesting, because if we go to my first of two European examples about what is actually
Excellent.
happening in practice today, and we're going to start with the not as strict, and then we're going to go to the most strict, which has started as of last December. But if we think not as strict, so we go to
Yeah.
Italy. Now, what is Italy doing? They are getting stricter, but they're getting stricter with places where the consumer doesn't really have another choice, right? So there isn't a broad piece of Italian legislation, but there is guidelines from ARERA, which is the utilities managing body, of basically what they expect from their utilities companies, and who have citizens. They haven't got
Yeah.
customers. They have customers, but
Very good point.
when you
So
are
they
the only
can't
person
necessarily.
providing
There's not much
water,
choice. Yeah.
exactly. But what have they done? So they have said that you have a 3 minute window to answer a phone call.
Yeah.
Okay. And any conversations that happen with an automated system count within that 3 minute window. So what does that mean? That means you can have your bot on the front end, but what you can't have is a bot that keeps saying, oh, that you didn't get that right. I didn't get that right. I didn't understand. You can't have a bot that says, well, let me take you back to that other menu and you can try again. Because if the bot takes more than 3 minutes to sort through the customer and figure out where the customer needs to go, then you're breaching your commitment that you've had to make to the regulator. So there's this idea that this golden 3-minute window of, I have to build a chatbot that's good enough to get the most it needs out of the query within 3 minutes, and then either decide that it's failed and connect you to a human being, or resolve your query and get you off the line. Now, how do you feel about that, right?
Yeah, I think that actually makes a lot of sense, because the constant "I don't understand, please could you repeat that" is extremely annoying. So yeah. I do get that as a sort of reasonable level, and I think the point that you've made, very eloquently there, is that works. That is really applicable in an environment where the consumer, or the citizen in that case, doesn't have they can't go with my option one of, if they think the customer service provided by X is poor, we'll go with Y. If there's no option, then actually it probably is quite good that there is some legislation that stops this obfuscation or delay period that might be completely unnecessary if the provider was willing to pay a bit more money to have more agents on staff, or whatever that might be. So I think that makes a lot more sense.
The knock-ons. So let's just talk about the knock-ons, because I had the pleasure of talking to a water company from Italy last week, and how have they responded to this, right? They still have the chatbot on their website. That's fine. Chatbot on the website is doing FAQs. That's perfectly fine. They've been mandated by the regulator. They actually have to open a physical office in every town or city where they provide service, because the regulator has said you also need to have a place where non-digital people can go and complain and talk to you about your service, right? So that's interesting as well. And I'm not saying that companies are going to be forced to open shops in every place they do online delivery. But the third thing that they did, which is kind of telling of the trouble with this kind of legislation, is they actually had to turn off their voice AI service. Because they built a voice AI service, it was working, it was good at answering FAQs, but they had a problem, which is that in practice, how would this workflow work? Reality, your customer calls up when they have a series of issues. They talk to the bot, they're going around in circles. They're not necessarily not getting answers, but whenever the bot tells them something, they're then saying, oh, that's interesting. Can you now tell me about this? Or they're talking about their other problem or something like that. And then after a quite long conversation, which gives the customer a lot of information and is actually quite useful, they then realize they have an issue that needs to speak to a human being. So that's the equivalent of me calling up to talk to you about the packet of Skittles I bought last week. And then after a 10-minute conversation where you've told me about food colorings and different things like that, I'm like, wait a second, actually, I need to speak to someone about this, when I didn't know that when I called up. And then suddenly this 15-minute call,
the timer's kicked in,
has been logged, because it wasn't prior to that something where the regulator would have been concerned, but now it suddenly is. So that company has actually had to turn off their voice agent because of these. The control of how long that call is with the consumer, right?
Yeah.
That's a problem. So it's tricky to understand what you do there, because it's actually not natural for that interaction to escalate to a human being.
No, and also, and you're losing the value there. That interaction is useful for the consumer, so it's unfair for them to be paid. I think the really interesting thing, and you were talking to me about this last week, is that demand for having a local presence in every town, so that you can, as you said, non-digital natives can physically go in and probably complain about the service they're repeating. It's really interesting. Finbarr, you and I have just done some public sector research for Zoom, where the studies will be coming out over the next few months, and it showed how important in-person interaction was. I think it was 45% of public sector bodies. That was in Germany and the UK. The in-person interaction was in their top 3 communication channels. So, and you're absolutely right. Not everybody especially who's using a utility, for example, like your example of water, is going to be digitally native, is going to have a mobile phone, is going to use a mobile app, is even going to be able to necessarily call on the telephone. So that is a really interesting thing, especially for publicly serving organizations serving citizens, to think of how they serve those customers.
And I mean, it is just, if you think about the world that we live in, where we assume digital native, smartphones, all these kind of things. For a long time in London, where I live, the local libraries, they're not actually called libraries anymore. They're called idea stores. But part of
I
the
didn't
reason
know.
that, huh?
I didn't know that. I did not know that. I didn't know
Oh,
they
okay, well
rebranded.
they're called idea stores. They're still called libraries sometimes as well. But the idea was that you're not just going to a library for books, because actually the role they fulfill in society now is different. What does the library, the idea store in Bow, where I live, actually do? It does cooking classes,
Yeah, more
DVDs,
community
CDs,
interaction. Yeah,
audiobooks, internet connectivity, computers, printing, health classes, anything you need. But with the premise that if you have a community, not everyone will have a PC in their home or a
yeah,
printer in their home.
makes sense.
These kind of things.
Yeah,
So that new model of I have a digital terminal for my utilities provider in an office in your town, and also people you can speak to. And maybe the first port of
yeah.
call when you go in isn't to speak to a person directly, it's to go to the digital terminal and
To use their system, yeah, to
but
use a terminal to communicate. Yeah,
it's all very, very interesting as we kind of think about the reason that I bring this up, and the reason that I think this is very interesting, is the utilities present a very interesting use case. What we're actually talking about here, and what a lot of the legislation that we're seeing develop in Europe is focused on, because trying to legislate for the next thing that AI is going to do is a nightmare and not something that we can practically do. But what we can do is legislate for the outcomes that we think customers are entitled to. And then, regardless of what's happening with the technology, we can demand that companies deliver on those outcomes. And that brings us into what is kind of the main talking point of the topic, which is what have Spain done?
yes.
So in December last year, I think the law went live on the 26th of December. So, still very, very fresh. Spain brought in kind of a broad reaching piece of consumer protection legislation, which applies standards of quality on outcomes to all companies with over 250 employees, over $50 million in revenue, all that work in certain protected industries, right? What is required of those companies now? So at a basic level, 95% of calls have to be answered within under 3 minutes. That is that rule that we said in Italy. It doesn't mean that you can't have AI on the front, but it means that either the customer has their query solved within 3 minutes by automation, or they are escalated to a person within 3 minutes.
Okay.
There is an explicit access right to humans. So you cannot put someone in a loop on a system ever. The end result of every automated interaction, it is either successful for the customer or there is a human being,
Yep.
right? There is just constraints on how you're building things so that they're not open-ended. It's called these dark patterns, where you try and deflect consumers by looping them into negative interactions and then getting them off the phone and considering it contained, right? This is really interesting. That's inbound. Yeah. So there's loads of different inbound changes that are happening in Spain. Outbound, things get even more interesting. So you obviously have to get people to opt in to communications. That's pretty standard.
Yeah.
There is a mandatory number specification for different types of outbound calls. What does that mean? That means that I, as a company, have to have 2 outbound numbers. One of them is a support number, and one of them is a sales number. So if I'm calling you as your bank, it's going to be +6621. And if I'm calling you as your bank to sell you something, it's +6631. And those numbers should be separate. And therefore customers will know whether they're getting a sales call from a company. And partly that's done to give customers protection from spam and scamming, but it's also kind of done to give telcos power and understanding of when companies are verified and calling. So if you're a bank, you have to have a legitimate outbound customer support number, which the onus is on the telcos that provide you your service to guarantee that number's security, so that whenever one of your customers gets a call, they know it is from the bank's customer service team. Very clear, right? And very, very powerful, right? And we're going even further. So I spoke to a Spanish online furniture retailer 2 weeks ago. He said that his company now has to They have 400 million in revenue. They also operate in Germany, Nordics, other different regions. He said his company now has to maintain a folder of audit logs, which is accessible by the government on request, on their customer service key KPIs. So calls answered, time to answer, all these things. They have to just have this data available. They have a burden of proof to prove their customer service is working correctly. They have to have an annual independent audit on those KPIs to see whether or not their customer service has met them. All customer service lines have to be free, so you can no longer have premium rate customer service either. All renewal services and charges have to be given 15 days notice. They have to be, there's no mandatory auto renewal for contracts from a distance. And very important for Europe as well, if you operate in a region where a different version of Spanish or a different Spanish language is present, you are mandated to provide support in that language. So there are 4 main languages in Spain. I can't remember them, but Basque, Catalan. You have to provide support. So if you operate in Barcelona, you have to have Basque support. So, obviously this is new, so we're not really sure how people are going to get punished or what the penalties and things are, but it's been indicated to me they're going to be quite strict. They're going to be quite strong, right? I've just told you a load of information. So what do you think about this? I mean,
yeah, it's really interesting. Have you, from the discussions that you've had, do you think this is something? Why has Spain been so strict on this immediately? And automatically, as soon as you were talking about the demographic restrictions in terms of the businesses that this is going to apply to, the demographics of the Spanish business market, there's a lot of small businesses which aren't going to be necessarily mandated to this because of probably the cost implications. But why have Spain moved first? And is this likely, from the discussions you've had, is this something that we might see elsewhere in Europe in terms of consumer protection as well?
I mean, in terms of why Spain's moved first, I mean, Spain is one of those markets where strong customer advocacy is a blueprint for the companies to follow. So, if you don't follow the Spanish market, if you talk to things like they initially had this big wave of outsourcing to Latin America. For a lot of companies, consumers didn't like that, and they brought it back. They were forced to bring it back. So, while some companies do still outsource, this demand and power of the Spanish consumer to dictate company behavior is actually quite strong and established in that market. I think a lot of countries as well have seen this EU AI Act. They've seen where the EU is going. They've decided to get out ahead of it. But I think there is appetite from consumers for this sort of legislation.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, I completely agree.
I mean, whether a country's going to do it is entirely a cultural thing. But I think the attitude is there. I think I called my bank yesterday. I was in 5 different menus. I spoke to someone who couldn't help me at the end of that. It took me about 15 minutes. That call shouldn't have taken 15 minutes. Yeah. I personally demand this sort of legislation. But I think in the growing area of technology where we can have these dark practices of looping people in bots that supposedly understand them, but are more focused with giving them an answer than are solving their problem. Yeah, these pieces of legislation will prove an interesting point, I think.
So how does this affect the provision of voice AI within Spain? It's still going to be relevant in the market. You can still use it up until a point. If it's as you said, if it's effective, if you solve a customer query, then it still works. So how much impact is that going to have?
Well, I think this is kind of a big question, right? Because one of the simplest ways you could implement this is just to pick a cutoff of a certain number of minutes. Once the customer hits that, you say, we haven't been able to resolve your problem, so we're going to escalate you to a person. And the customer can, maybe there's a system where the customer can say, no, actually, I think you can resolve this for me, and chooses not to be escalated. But I think at the start, you probably just have to focus on that escalation so that you meet your KPI. After that, I think this is really just an incentive to keep investing in AI. I think this is really an incentive to keep investing in voice AI that understands the customer and can solve their queries. And then if they're not solving those queries, taking that data and passing it directly into the hands of an agent to get that, full workflow of bot into agent that understands what the customer's problem was, right? Because in an ideal world, the customer says their problem, the voice AI agent understands it, understands if it's self-service or not, and then does it, right?
Yeah.
Now, in reality, what I think is going to happen is a lot of companies are going to build a bot that's very good at figuring out whether someone can do something via a website or another application. And they're going to make sure that those calls are directed hard towards that application. And then only when the customer resists that strongly, they're going to
then you'll go directly into the biz. Got you. Interesting. And so, what do you think? It's sort of final bit. What in terms of, we talked about how it impacts voice AI. What about CCaaS CX vendors within Spain? What's the advice in terms of what they need to be thinking about now?
This is interesting because I don't know if this changes the trajectory of the industry at all. Beyond just an understanding that, we talk a lot about human beings going away, but obviously if we have this mandatory,
it's legislated, it can't.
That slows down the trajectory of human beings going away, right? And think about the things that make this system work well for the customer. Solid data flow through from the bot to the user agent that they end up connected with. No customer who's been on the phone for 2 minutes explaining their problem wants to re-explain that problem, re-authenticate, anything like that. So those kind of things that we're already working on are already there. So I don't know if it necessarily changes the strategy so much as, people should be aware that these things are coming, and that, Spain could be a leading market, leading the way in Europe, right? If you look at other markets, like Italy could easily go this way. France believes in strong consumer protection. And Europe has been more than happy repeatedly in the past to let one country test out a piece of legislation. And then if they see it working, start to think, actually, we could do that as well. So I think a lot of people are going to be watching the Spanish market now. They're going to see, our customers happy? Are companies meeting this? They're going to see how many companies aren't, how many companies are failing. And they're going to be watching the big question, I think, when these sorts of regulations are passed, because it is quite restrictive, is, are we losing competitive value, innovation, capabilities because of this? Is there things like that company I spoke to in Italy where the voice AI is being turned off and my company is not as competitive, not as adaptable, as agile as its competitors from other markets in Europe, right?
No, it's really interesting. Very interesting, Finbarr. And I think there's multiple arguments. What does it do to agent numbers? You have to have those protected. You also there's an argument that it accelerates innovation and having better chat, because you don't want any duplication of authentication, as you said, or context required to be. So there's lots of interesting impacts. So it's something we'll have to track over the coming years.
Exactly, and you have to be careful about looping, because if the conversation goes on too long, then you're in trouble with the government. So
and you have to be careful about looping, because otherwise the conversation goes on for too long. See what I did there, listener?
Very good. So I think that's just where we stand. I think it's early days of this regulation, but I think it's really interesting to see, because we were asking last year, EU said what they want from AI, what are actual countries going to do about it? We've kind of seen a varying level of responses, and I think it's only going to get more interesting. As a consumer, and as someone who's always said, I advocate for consumer rights, I think this is good, and I think we are going to move into a direction of better consumer protection, more accountability, and the knock-on for that is that we just have to build better AI and keep people answering the phones when it's relevant, when it's appropriate, when it makes sense, which has always been, we've said, coming from the communication side of CCaaS, is the gold standard of customer service. And just to say, as we have been saying, the more you automate consumer conversation, the more you automate your front end. If you've successfully reduced, as some companies have, the number of calls that escalate from chatbot from 20% down to 5% by improving the chatbot, that's fantastic. But then how do you differentiate from your competitors on customer service? Every single call that gets through, every single time a customer takes time out of their day to pick up the phone and actually try and speak to you, that is your gold standard of how to make your customer feel special. Did I feel particularly good about Barclays yesterday when I had a 15-minute conversation with a bot, looping around in menus, and finally spoke to a human being who had no clue what I was talking about and couldn't help me with my problem because the system didn't have enough information or tools for him to do that? I did not. did I immediately consider switching to a different bank, despite the fact that I had been a Barclays customer for 13 years, because they failed me on a very, very simple thing? I did. The stakes are incredibly high. The less your customers actually speak to you, the more automated they are, the more a single point of interaction can cause them to churn. So these sorts of regulations, they are a double-edged sword for the industry, but your customers are starting to expect better.
Yeah.
And this regulation might push some companies to do better. A rising tide lifts all boats, as we say. If you come
really
from
good point.
the coast, you know. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found that interesting. Are you concerned about the regulations in your country? We can't help you with that, but we can talk to you about why they're interesting. And we want to know if there's a piece of legislation in your country that we haven't heard of or you think that we would find interesting. Do get out, reach out, let us know. You are not allowed to bring maracas onto a phone call in Mexico for customer service for obscure reasons. No, I don't know that's true. I'm just saying something culturally relevant that might be different from country to country. Anyway, speak to you all very, very soon.
Bye, everyone.